With its first two installments, Final Fantasy established itself as a solid RPG series that would continually strive for innovation. FF2 in particular ended up an especially radical departure from the first game in multiple ways, but most noticeably its approach to storytelling and character progression. Yet these differences weren't necessarily considered straight upgrades, just differing creative directions. So when the time for the third game came around, I can only imagine there was some serious questioning about what direction to take the game in. Since opinions have shifted on the second installment over time, it can be easy to forget that it was initially just as well received as the original game, so audiences didn't necessarily lean towards one approach or the other just yet. So what exactly would Square have to do to keep this new installment fresh for its audiences? Before I get into the game itself, I want to briefly touch on my own personal history with it. So similarly to FF2, playing through Final Fantasy III for this video was not my first exposure to it, but it was my first time playing the game through to completion. Unlike FF2 though, I couldn't tell you why I put this one down midway through. I do remember liking what I played, but I didn't think much more of it than that. And it's not like I intentionally dropped it either, I just kind of stopped playing one day and never came back to finish. And since it's not one of the more popular titles in the series, I didn't have that much motivation to return. However, similarly to the last game, I think that part of the reason this game is talked about so little relative to the other games of its era is because of its delayed release in the West. We didn't get an official release of FF2 over here until the PlayStation port in 2003, but with FF3 we had to wait even longer, not receiving any version of the game at all until the DS remake in 2006. And that's actually something that I want to go ahead and talk about right now. Like I mentioned in their respective videos, the first two Final Fantasy games got countless re-releases, so it may be easy to assume that 3 got the same treatment, but that really wasn't the case at all. The first two games were ported to the WonderSwan in Japan exclusively, and that version was what ended up getting used as the basis for all the later re-releases that we eventually got here in the West. FF3 was also set for a WonderSwan release, but that ended up getting cancelled, so whenever the other games would get ported, 3 was always left out. So as a result, there's only 3 major versions to talk about this time: the Famicom Original, the 3D Remake, and the Pixel Remaster. The Famicom Original is pretty much what you'd expect at this point, but I still want to spend some time talking about it specifically because it was especially impressive for its time. It's still working off the same hardware from the first 2 games, but this time they were able to use a cartridge that was twice the size of those previous installments. So the game is pretty huge, and I'll get into the specifics of all of it later, but for now just know that FF3 is massive for a Famicom game. And presentation-wise, the game has actually gotten a fairly noticeable bump up in quality from before. Sprites are more detailed, the game's color scheme feels a lot more vibrant, and the game just generally looks better. The animations are a pretty noticeable upgrade as well. There's a lot of extra personality here, especially when it comes to the NPC interactions. It's not a huge upgrade or anything. I mean, we're still working with Famicom hardware, so it's nothing too crazy, but if you know what to look for, you can tell this is a pretty substantial improvement. This is also where the game started to adopt that classic Final Fantasy blue for all of the battle menus, and I think it helps the game's aesthetic really pop. I've praised the soundtrack in every game in the series up to this point, but Final Fantasy III deserves specific acclaim for mastering the Famicom hardware, to a point where every track is able to sound so full and vibrant. One of the most simple ways this is done is by having one of the sound channels mimic percussion for all of the battle themes. It makes those themes so much more energetic and makes it all really exciting. Here's a comparison between the battle themes of FF2 and 3 just so you can see how much of a difference this makes. Another interesting technique that I noticed in the soundtrack here is that sometimes 2 of the channels will be playing almost the exact same melody, but delayed just a little bit so that it mimics a delay effect to further flesh out the sound and give it a more ethereal feeling. And just to drive the point home even further, I think the best way to showcase the effect this has is to compare it to the previous games that didn't have it. So here's the prelude from the first game compared to the same prelude in the third. I'm not exactly an expert on the Famicom sound hardware, so I can't really give a full analysis of all the techniques that were used or anything like that, but I still figured that it was worth pointing out the things that I did notice to paint a clearer picture of what exactly Uematsu did here to elevate this specific soundtrack above the previous ones, at least from a technological standpoint. I've taken a bit of time in each of the last videos to discuss the artwork of Yoshitaka Amano, so if you've already seen those videos, then you probably know pretty much exactly what I'm about to say. Since the Famicom was so limited visually, this art helped to establish a mental image of the world and characters that the players would keep with them and project onto the in-game sprites. And yeah, the art mostly accomplishes the exact same thing here, and I still think that it looks great. However, if I'm being entirely honest, I feel that Final Fantasy III, even in its original form, is where the outside art becomes less necessary to the experience. I feel like by this point, the development team has gotten significantly more comfortable with the hardware, and that shows with a game that's able to confidently drive its own visual aesthetic through in-game assets without having to rely on external material. There's even points here where I feel like the art actually contradicts what we see on screen. Like, do you really expect me to believe that this is a chocobo? Or that this is the Cloud of Darkness? No, there's no way these are the same thing. So this is the last time that I'll bring up Amano's artwork in this context, though I may briefly talk about some specific pieces in future videos. He has continued to make art for the series ever since. He still designs the logo for each game and a bunch of promotional pieces, but from what I understand, his work isn't nearly as directly involved with the game development as it used to be. Still though, I don't want to imply that I have anything other than the utmost respect for Amano and his art. He's contributed so much to the series and it's impossible to not appreciate that. There are a few other quality of life improvements on the gameplay side of things that also help to make FF3 a much smoother experience than its predecessors. I thought about going into these a bit more, but many of these were retroactively added into the updated re-releases of the first two games, so I don't really want to focus on them as I still want the primary focus of this retrospective series to be on the most modern and updated versions of these games currently available. But I still wanted to bring them up just to mention how much of a leap forward FF3 was from a technological standpoint. Even just in the brief section that I played to record footage for this video, I found it way more enjoyable than the pieces I played of either of the first two games. However, like I mentioned earlier, this version of the game was never officially released in the West. The first English release of Final Fantasy III that we got over here was actually the 3D remake on the DS. This wasn't released until 16 years after the original Famicom release, meaning that just like FF2, Western players didn't get to experience this one until it was well removed from its original context. Since it was so far removed from the original game, this remake felt the need to change some things to appeal to modern audiences. I could make a whole video on the remake if I really wanted to, but just to keep this more focused, I'll do a brief run over of what makes this version of the game unique. Obviously, the presentation has had a massive overhaul. The visuals are now fully 3D and the camera is much more dynamic. The style hasn't aged super gracefully, but I think for a DS game coming out around this time, it looks just fine. The soundtrack was also totally redone, and I guess you could call this an upgrade as the technology being used here was much more advanced, but I don't know, it feels kind of flat to me, to the point where I would just rather listen to the chiptune originals. It's definitely not terrible, and I really can't pinpoint what it is about this that rubs me the wrong way, but just listen to this comparison for yourself and decide what you think of it. Aside from presentation though, the 3D remake actually has a pretty significant overhaul in the way that the story is told. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but for now I'll just say that there are way more cutscenes than the 2D version of the game ever had, and that they attempt to give more character to the main party. Whereas the 2D version of the game starts you off with 4 unnamed and identical looking Onion Knights, the 3D version gives these characters unique designs and names. Lunith, Ark, Refia, and Ingus are the heroes in this version of the game, and from what I played, they are just about as flat as you could realistically get away with in 2006. There is a lot more party banter than there was in the original, but that doesn't really mean anything when the dialogue felt just as engaging as Final Fantasy II, which if you remember was a game that I criticized for its extremely dry script. Many things about the game have actually remained unchanged, such as dungeon design, world layout, and the overall plot, so in that regard it's relatively faithful, but a lot of other minor things have been changed to rebalance the experience. For example, the capacity point system has been replaced by job adjustment phases, you can no longer encounter more than 3 enemies at a time, and supposedly the overall game is much harder. I say supposedly because I didn't bother checking out more than an hour of this for the sake of recording footage, and after what I played I'm not exactly motivated to return to it. You can probably tell by my tone, but I was not at all impressed by my time with the 3D remake, and from what I've seen online, it doesn't seem like my issues get remedied later down the road. I understand that by 2006, trying to make an accurate recreation of Final Fantasy III probably wouldn't have been appealing to most players, but I definitely would have preferred that to this half-assed modernization that we got instead. I don't care about the new characters, I don't like how it takes away from the fun of role-playing from the original, and I don't care for the overhauled visuals either, and I especially don't like the fact that for 15 years, this was the only legal way to play this game in English. I know that this release does have its fans, and hey, if you're one of them, all the more power to you. It's just not for me. If you do want to check it out though, Square also ported it to the PSP and eventually Steam, so you can still play it there. The Steam version is what I recorded just because it's the most accessible, and even though I don't particularly like this version, I'm glad Square didn't delist it when the Pixel remaster came out. It has more than enough distinctions from the original that I think it should be preserved. I just don't think it ever should have been considered a replacement. Thankfully, that's not something that we have to worry about anymore now that the Pixel remaster is out, and Western fans can finally play an official English release of the original 2D version of Final Fantasy III. And just like the previous games, this is what I ended up playing for this video, and it's the one that I'd easily recommend to newcomers. Super easy to pick up and play, updates the visuals in a faithful style, has an amazing new soundtrack arrangement overseen by Uematsu himself, and most importantly for our purposes, preserves the design philosophy of the original game. Put right next to the Pixel remasters of the first 2 games, the evolution of the series is kept totally intact, which is what I appreciate about these remasters more than anything. Okay, now that I've finally finished talking about all the different versions of this game, I can start digging into the game itself. Starting this will look pretty familiar to anyone that played the first game. The first thing you do is once again name your characters. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but Final Fantasy III's approach to the main party reverts back to how FF1 handled its party in the sense that the characters are total blank slates that you project your own creations onto. And just like before, I think it works pretty well here. I can imagine this being a pretty unexpected turn for some players after FF2 pivoted so hard so quickly into more direct storytelling, but I don't think it's a bad thing that 2 games in the same series can take 2 very different approaches and still coexist. The key difference in this opening screen lies in the fact that you don't get to choose your party members' classes like you did before. But other than that, anyone who played the first game is going to feel right at home very quickly here. After an extremely brief introduction, your party of 4 Onion Knights opens the game by falling down a hole, and as they try to find a way out, they stumble upon the Wind Crystal, which informs them that they are the 4 Warriors of Light, and they need to track down the rest of the crystals to save the world from impending darkness. So not only is this reusing the same storytelling approach as FF1, it's reusing the exact same premise. In any other game, I feel like I'd have more of an issue with this, but luckily since the premise of save the world from darkness is so broad, FF3 is able to get away with it by making the journey in between crystals so much more entertaining than before. Just like before, there's a lot of stops and subplots along the way that may not directly contribute to the plot, but end up leading you in the right direction to finding the crystals. Only this time, those subplots are way more fun and memorable. I can attribute a lot of this improvement to the animations in the script, which are filled with way more personality and life than previous installments ever had to offer. Going to a town feels like entering a place with real people and culture, and you can feel this as soon as the first village in the game. Your party may not have canon names, but you can tell that everyone has a unique relationship with you and treats you accordingly. Whether they're extremely close to you, like Nina who acted as a mother to you, or whether they're a passing neighbor that simply knew you as you grew up, all the dialogue here accurately reflects your place in the town. Villagers have their own homes, and some will even hint you in on where to find secrets in the town. It's all very well realized, and all of the towns in the game are like this. I even noticed a lot of special interactions that were completely optional, like villagers dancing or farmers rushing to stop you from trampling over their crops. Every time you finish one of the subplots and return to a town that you helped, the music is always triumphant and all the residents are grateful to you. It makes you feel like your actions really had an impact past just progressing the plot. It's a lot of little things, but they're scattered all over the game and go a long way into injecting life into this world. But even as the world is more alive thanks to moments like this, the scenarios you follow here are just generally a lot more interesting. The first game had you doing things like saving a town from pirates or tracking down a stolen crystal eye to help a witch see again, and those worked fine, but they weren't especially interesting. In this game, you're doing things like turning yourself tiny so you can visit a village of gnomes, or stopping a possessed king from forcing his own kingdom into civil war. These more unique environments and scenarios lead to much more engaging and memorable subplots, and these vignettes are all well paced enough that the game ends up having a very nice flow to it. This story setup also gives way to a fantastic sense of progression. When you start the game, you're enclosed pretty tight within this one area, but you gradually unlock the tools to see more and more of the continent the more that you play. And eventually you discover that the continent you spent the whole game on up to that point is just an island floating above a much larger world. And you finally leave to discover nearly the entire world below you covered in ocean. It's a pretty striking moment because of just how hard it hits home the scale of the game. And as the game keeps going, that feeling of growth never stops. You unlock numerous different airships throughout the game, each one giving you access to another layer of the world. You have the Enterprise, which lets you leave the floating continent in the first place, followed by the Nautilus, which is incredibly fast and can let you access an entirely new underwater layer of the map, and then finally the Invincible, this absolute behemoth that's so big you can even walk around on deck. Not only can this thing fly over mountains, but it can even shoot down enemies in the air. It's really cool and it makes you feel powerful just for being able to pilot it. What's especially clever about how the game handles this expansion of the world is how it's able to seamlessly weave lore discoveries into the progression. For example, to return to the example I talked about earlier where you leave the floating continent and discover the flooded world below, not only are you seeing an entirely new portion of the world, but you're simultaneously learning more about it. It doesn't take long after this for you to meet these characters named Doga and Une who tell you the reason behind the flood in the first place, and that's Xandi. Xandi was originally a disciple of the great mage Noah alongside both Doga and Une, and one day they all received gifts. Doga and Une were given strong magic, but Xandi was gifted mortality. This made him so angry that he caused the flood and separated the floating continent from the rest of the world, kicking off the impending darkness that was mentioned at the very beginning of the game. Defeating Xandi ultimately ends up being the final objective of the game, so the escalation there is perfectly set up and doesn't come out of nowhere like in the first game. I think the way they incorporated the lore dumps into this game is actually pretty smart, because it means that the more you see of the world, the more you learn about it. Once you get towards the end of the game, the story actually reveals itself to have a fairly clever subversion of the premise from the first game. It is true that your party are the Warriors of Light and are set out to stop darkness from taking over, but that's not quite everything that's going on here. The game actually establishes that light and dark are a delicate balance that need to keep each other in check. And we're even told about another time where there were 4 Warriors of Darkness that needed to use the dark crystals to stop light from taking over. It's not exactly the most mind-blowing twist compared to the stories that we get in games now, but for the time I think it was pretty interesting and it gives the game an extra layer of depth. Unfortunately, this also leads into what is, in my opinion, the weakest part of the game's story, and that's the last-minute reveal that Xandi was just being manipulated the whole time by this evil being known as the Cloud of Darkness. This trope of the main villain being revealed as a puppet to a greater force comes up pretty often in JRPGs, and as far as I'm aware, this is the earliest example of it. I've never really liked this trope, and this is no exception. It just kind of comes out of nowhere and destroys the stakes that were built up pretty well throughout the rest of the game for a surprise villain that was never even mentioned up to this point. The saving grace here is that you actually do get to fight with the help of the Warriors of Darkness to take this thing down, and that is a pretty cool moment, but aside from that, I don't think there was any reason to drag this game out past the fight with Xandi. Still, it's such a small part of the game, and for the story to be legitimately solid up to its very final moments should be considered a big accomplishment for this series. I feel like it's clear from my description of the story that although it starts as essentially a second take at FF1's ideas, it ultimately reveals that it has a lot more going on. And with the way the plot progresses, I would even argue that it actually leans into the direct storytelling from FF2. I always liked what the stories from both of the first 2 games aspired to do, but this approach of mixing the 2 methods has produced something that has the positives of both approaches and just the right balance of ideas so that neither is holding back the other. The result is, in my opinion, easily the most compelling story in the series up to this point. It's nothing too crazy, but it's clearly not trying to be a narrative masterwork or anything like that. It's a fun fantasy backdrop with memorable moments and a ton of charm that held my interest from start to finish. And I have to admit, that's a lot better than I expected from a 1990 Famicom game. One quick note regarding the story that I want to address before I wrap up this part of the discussion is that I've heard some people describe FF3's story as a downgrade from 2's more ambitious and direct storytelling, and I really disagree with this. Technologically speaking, I think there's more than enough unique scripted sequences to prove that the game is more than capable of providing direct storytelling when it wants to. It just doesn't want to do too much of that so that it doesn't intrude on the player's own role-playing experience, which is a delicate balance that I really appreciate. So the general approach to storytelling here is a pretty successful fusion between the best parts of the first two games, and I think it works pretty well for what it is. But this approach of mixing the best of both worlds can also be found in Final Fantasy III's gameplay and RPG mechanics, and for the most part I'm happy to say it results in the same outcome. I want to start by talking about what is probably the single defining aspect of FF3, and that's the introduction of the job system. Remember earlier in the video where I mentioned how you don't choose your classes at the start of the game? Well, when you first run into the Wind Crystal after a brief tutorial dungeon, you'll discover why. This is where you get your first set of jobs, which are essentially classes that you can switch between whenever you like. It starts off pretty simple, basically just giving you the same options that you had from FF1, but your options only get wider and wider throughout the game. Each time you reach a crystal, you'll get more and more jobs until you eventually have a whole 20 to choose from. And if you do an optional dungeon towards the very end, you can even bump that number up to 22. That's a pretty astounding level of freedom compared to the older titles. The jobs themselves mostly have unique attributes and abilities to set themselves apart. For example, the Thief can steal items from enemies, the Knight can protect party members from fatal damage, the Dragoon can do a jump attack, the Geomancer can use different elemental abilities based on the battle environment. I could go on and on with examples, but you get the idea. I think these new jobs actually do a pretty good job of rounding the game out, and it felt like I had a much more well-balanced party throughout because of them. For example, physical fighters used to pretty much exclusively attack single targets, maybe use an item in dire situations, but now they have more unique abilities and I have more for them to do throughout most battles, and especially in boss battles. Not all jobs are created equal though. For every totally original job that you unlock, you'll unlock another that's pretty much just a direct upgrade of a previous job. These aren't exactly the most inspired or exciting, but it can still be a really cool feeling to take a party member who's been spending a lot of time as one particular job and give them a stat bump, or maybe even a new ability that adds onto their previous skills. It reminds me a lot of the class upgrade from the original game, only way more organic. Speaking of jobs that are direct upgrades, the Magus and the Devout are essentially the strongest forms of the Black and White mages, and I like these upgrades so much more than the Black and White wizards from the first game. They keep the shape of the original design largely identifiable, but they spice it up with extra decorations that make it still feel like a more powerful version of the previous job. Much better than those humanoid designs that you got towards the end of FF1. And these upgrades do something pretty clever with the amount of magic that you can use too. Spell charges are back from FF1, and you may remember that in that game I thought that system discouraged me from using magic as much as I wanted to because of how few spell charges were available. Here though, you get way more, enough to comfortably use magic in every battle whether it's an important one or not. As mages though, you'll notice that most of your charges are concentrated at the lower levels, so when you finally get that upgraded job and see an immediate bump in the amount of spell charges that you have available for the higher tiered magic, you instantly feel more powerful in a super organic way. Tangent aside, I just really like the Magus and the Devout. I wish we got to see more of these jobs throughout the series. To get back on track though, you're constantly considering strengths and weaknesses when you build a party, but being able to modify your party composition at any given point means that your planning becomes more situational and less general. It allows you to get risky and change things on the fly so that you can adapt your party to the current situation, and it can be really fun. The original Famicom version of the game and the 3D remake both had systems put in place to stop you from switching too much, and that's something that I never really understood, but with the Pixel remaster, those systems are completely gone, and I really do think that that's for the better. Discouraging switching like that made it a much more calculated decision, as you wouldn't be able to turn back on it for some time, but being able to switch with practically no consequences encourages experimentation and makes the system much more fun overall. The game does actually give you reason to stick with certain jobs for longer though, and that's thanks to job levels. These are separate from your main character level, but basically the higher a job level you have, the better you are at performing that specific job, and the higher your base stats associated with that job are. So this way, even though switching jobs is encouraged, you'll also want to constantly be thinking ahead about what you want specific characters to be most efficient in, and generally give them jobs adjacent to those areas. If this all sounds familiar, it should. It's pretty much the exact same philosophy behind Final Fantasy II's controversial leveling system. Here though, it's a lot easier to appreciate because of how organically it becomes a part of a system that's so much simpler and easier to understand. And it's not so rigid that you'll be pigeonholed into a specific progression path at any point. It just gives you a further advantage for staying relatively consistent. But it never at any point detracts from the adaptive nature that the job system inspires, and that's the most important part. This adaptive approach is constantly encouraged by the game design too. One early example that I remember was when I found this sword that was especially effective against undead enemies, but could only be wielded by a red mage. Then, when I entered a dungeon with a lot of undead enemies, I was able to turn my warrior into a red mage and have an advantage because of it. Other times, switching jobs was more like a puzzle where you had to figure out the right approach for a specific area. For example, there's a few sections where you have to cast Mini on your party to access smaller areas, but when you have the Mini status effects, you take more damage and your physical attacks are almost worthless. So the solution here is to turn your whole party into mages and put them all in the back row, so that way you have a fair chance during encounters. Another example of this is the Cave of Darkness, where all the enemies can split into numerous copies of themselves, so the best solution is to use jobs with abilities that can target multiple enemies in the same move. I did this by going into the dungeon with a party loadout of a black mage, a dark knight, a white mage, and a black belt. And this ended up working out for me because my black mage could cast spells on multiple enemies at once, the dark knight could use blade blitz to attack the whole screen, the black belt could do the same with a kick move, and the white mage could keep up with healing and support. Eventually I opted to swap out the black belt for a second dark knight as I noticed that it gave me a slight advantage, but it's thanks to the game's freeform job switching mechanics that I was able to make this spontaneous change in the first place. These solutions are usually pretty satisfying to me, but the one exception that I take to that is the infamous Garuda fight. Essentially, the only solution here is to turn your entire party into dragoons and use the jump command to avoid this absurdly powerful lightning attack. Even then though, this isn't really a reliable way to take down the boss, as you have no control over the turn order here, and it's entirely possible that the lightning attack will hit you anyway, so you just have to pray that you get good RNG. This took me multiple attempts to beat this fight, and when I finally did overcome it, it wasn't because I did anything different, it's just because I got lucky. Very poor boss design, but I want to stress this is the sole occasion where the forced job switching didn't work for me. Every other time I actually enjoyed finding the solution. Whenever I see people talk about this game online, I typically see people mention that they don't like how changing jobs often feels like a solution to a puzzle in this game. But to be honest, I don't understand why this would be an issue for anyone if they didn't already have the hindsight of future games that handled their job systems better. For the first game to implement a system like this, I think forcing you to come up with specific solutions is a really good way to get you in the right headspace for experimentation in the first place, and it works to get you out of your comfort zone if you're not exactly used to constantly changing your party structure over the course of the game. Although, if I'm being completely honest, outside of those instances where experimentation is practically forced, it is pretty easy to coast through most of the game with a fairly standard party setup. And I think that a lot of that has to do with just how many jobs here are slightly unique variations off of a standard physical fighter. Knight, Viking, Dragoon, Black Belt, etc., these all accomplish largely the same role. The same can't really be said for magic users though, at least not as far as I found. And aside from evokers and summoners, which are basically the same job anyway, no other job as far as I'm aware can use magic. So unless you're deliberately trying to avoid that more traditional party setup, you'll probably always have a black and a white mage as well as one if not two primary physical fighters. In hindsight, I realize that I probably could have gone without a magic user in my party more frequently, but I really like being able to consistently hit that elemental damage, something that's emphasized way more in this game thanks to new abilities that let you view enemy weaknesses. And I always want to have a solid healer in my party when I play these games, so there was no way I was going to go without a white mage unless it was absolutely necessary. In fairness to the game, the tools to break out of that more standard structure were there, but I would have liked a bit more flexibility in the job selection to feel more comfortable doing so. Another nitpick I have regarding the job system is how, for as much as on-the-fly experimentation is encouraged and rewarded, there's one minor drawback when it comes to switching to and from magic jobs. It's tricky to describe, but whenever you switch jobs, you keep your spell charges from the previous job up to the limit that the new job allows. But since so many physical jobs don't allow any spell charges at all, that means that switching from a physical job to a magic job will leave you with no spell charges whatsoever and no way to use any of your magic. This is only worsened by the fact that outside of a few designated recovery points, there's no good way to restore your spell charges at will. There's no ethers or tents or anything like that. It's not the worst issue in the world, to be honest, and I see why they don't want to fill up spell charges whenever you switch to a new job, because that would be super easy to exploit, but it definitely led to a few annoying moments where it felt like my options were artificially limited. The last gripe I have with the job system is how despite all these options for jobs, none of them are really explained in-game at all. There's a pretty decent amount of options, but without outside help, the only way you would know that is if you specifically tried all of them out and paid attention to all of their stats and all that. Again, it's not the biggest issue in the world, especially now that online guides are so easily accessible, but I would definitely recommend going into this one with some outside help just to get a better idea of what all the jobs are useful for. So the job system isn't quite perfect, but I do think that for a first crack at the formula, it's pretty good, and it's a great seamless combination of the best ideas from the first two Final Fantasy games. It's easily my favorite of the progression systems we've seen so far from the series, and it's okay that there's room to grow from here. What matters most is that as it is, the job system works and serves this game well. Even outside of the RPG mechanics, I'm happy to say that we're looking at the best in the series so far when it comes to gameplay. I already talked about how I think the scenarios here are way more fun than they were before, but almost every single aspect of Final Fantasy III is a total improvement off of its predecessors. The dungeons are easily the biggest improvement for me. If you saw my previous videos, you know how heavily I criticized the dungeons in those games, especially FF2 with its terrible layouts designed deliberately to waste your time. In comparison to that game, the dungeons here are extremely straightforward. There should never be any confusion about the path forward, there's always a simple path to follow without any real deviations, and the dungeons here never try to play any tricks on you. They're much shorter this time around and can even have fun gimmicks to play off of the job system like I mentioned earlier. So dungeons are actually pretty fun in Final Fantasy III, which is so much more than I ever could have said for the first two games. Even though the dungeons are much more straightforward now, there's still plenty of hidden rewards for those who are willing to look for them. This game places a fairly heavy emphasis on hidden pathways, even outside of the dungeons, and I think it's a pretty effective way to get you to pay closer attention to your surroundings. However, when talking about dungeons in Final Fantasy III, there is one especially notorious dungeon that I have to mention, and that's the Crystal Tower. This is arguably the most infamous dungeon in the entire Final Fantasy series. I had heard countless horror stories from people who had played the game over the years. It's the last dungeon in the game and it's a pretty brutal gauntlet. It took me a whole hour and 45 minutes to get through, and it's filled with all of the most dangerous enemies in the game and multiple boss fights. Grinding is all but required to stand a chance of making it out the other end, and there are no save points throughout the entire thing. All of this is why I was so nervous to finally reach the dungeon myself, but I was relieved to see that the Pixel Remaster took some very appreciated steps to make this dungeon a bit less harsh. Don't get me wrong, it's still a tough dungeon and a pretty big difficulty spike, and you'll still probably want to grind a bit, but in this version of the game, it's nowhere near as terrible as it could have potentially been. This is thanks to a few things, arguably the biggest of all being the quick save function allowing you to give yourself a checkpoint whenever you want. So if you die, you don't have to restart the whole thing anymore. And once you get to the final section, you get a free restore point after every boss fight, which helps so much in keeping your resources topped off. The Crystal Tower is still a significant endgame challenge no matter what version you play, but the Pixel Remaster makes it substantially more manageable, and because of that, I didn't mind it too much, and I kinda appreciated the massive scale of it more than I would have if I had played one of the other versions. It's a really climactic finale to the game, and honestly, I would still rather go through that again than most of the dungeons from Final Fantasy II. As for combat in general, I would honestly say that the battles here felt much more well-balanced than anything from the first two games. Standard encounters finally have me doing more than having my entire team attack every turn, and that's largely thanks to all the changes that came with the job system. I mentioned most of this before, but new physical abilities, increased spell charges, and a much heavier emphasis on enemy weaknesses all add up to give you significantly more viable strategies for even the most basic fights. Some encounters will even catch you off guard with the back attack, where your front and back rows are reversed, usually leaving you in more immediate danger and making you play more carefully to get out of the battle with as little damage as possible. All of these changes make the average encounter noticeably more engaging than it ever was before. And the boss fights are a lot more fun this time around too, just on account of them taking longer. In the previous games, I always felt like by the time there was finally a good fight going, it would be over before I knew it, and it made so many bosses feel unsatisfying to defeat. Here, they all last just long enough to feel like a genuine obstacle that you have to overcome, but never too long to the point where they become a chore to fight. Outside of combat, one of the returning mechanics that actually really surprised me was the rotating party member. These were introduced in Final Fantasy II, but I really didn't like their inclusion there because of how weak they were and how their presence detracted from the team-building potential of that game's leveling system. Here, I like them a lot more because they don't actually take up a party slot at all. They'll join the party and follow you around, and you can even talk to them for some extra dialogue or hints on where to go next, but you'll never worry about having to take care of them or leveling them or anything like that. And since none of your party slots are dependent on a rotating member, you'll always have a full party of 4 and can plan your team accordingly. Much better implementation of this idea. I also think this game deserves extra credit for having a healthy variety of optional content to tackle, and most of it gives you worthwhile rewards too. There's extra dungeons and towns here that aren't required for the main story, but the extra experience, equipment, summons, even jobs in one case make these more than worth seeking out. Speaking of summons, those were actually first introduced here, and the way that they're used is pretty unique. You learn summoning spells just like you would any other magic, but they can only be used by evokers or their upgraded job summoners, although technically they can also be used by sages, but you won't have access to that job until the Crystal Tower. There's a few different mythical creatures you can summon to help you out in battle, and all of them have a random chance of using one of their 2 moves, one black magic move and one white magic move. These moves are all pretty powerful and will typically be more effective than any single move that you can use on your own, depending on the magic tier of course. And by doing some of the optional dungeons I mentioned earlier, you can hunt down especially powerful summons. You can even summon Bahamut from FF1 and Leviathan from FF2 to help you out. It's really cool. As for other series staples that were introduced here, this game has the first appearance of Moogles, and these guys go on to be a recurring creature throughout most Final Fantasy games from this point onward. By this point, they're one of the most iconic symbols of the series, so it was pretty fun to see where they got their start. And there's also the Fat Chocobo, who isn't nearly as iconic, but still a fun recurring character from game to game around this point in the series' history. If you've been keeping up with this retrospective series up to this point, you've probably noticed that my tone in this video is significantly more positive than that of either of the first 2 games. And to put it bluntly, that's because I like Final Fantasy III way more than its predecessors. It's not without problems, but honestly, I was just shocked that I enjoyed this game as much as I did, after I was preparing myself for another extremely dated Famicom RPG. It has aged, but unlike before, I don't think that's to the game's detriment. It is an old game, and it's definitely been outdone since, but I don't think that these are reasons to discredit it. Playing this game on its own reveals an enjoyable retro RPG, but playing it immediately after the first 2 games makes its accomplishments so much more meaningful. Playing it for this retrospective series has really made me realize how much my experience of a game can be enhanced by my understanding of its context, and I can only hope that making this video will help some of you appreciate what this game did in a new light. Final Fantasy III is a good game regardless of whether or not you played the previous ones, and it makes me really happy to say that with no caveats. I'm confident that anyone who generally enjoys retro RPGs can pick up FF3 and have a good time with it, but as someone who's closely following the history of the series up to this point, I found diving into this game's storytelling and design philosophies pretty fascinating. Combining the approaches of the 2 previous games is a simple enough idea, but I'm honestly pretty shocked at just how seamless a fusion that ended up being while still feeling unique. I regret putting it off for so long, but I am very glad that this was how I first experienced Final Fantasy III. I never realized how big of a leap forward this game was for the series, but I see now why its original Japanese release was so much more successful than the first 2 games. I understand why this was the game to catapult Final Fantasy into widespread acclaim, and I wish that it got more appreciation from modern fans of the series. As the last game in the Famicom trilogy, it perfectly wraps up this chapter of the franchise.